The Last Whites, Only Sign, A Town's Reckoning with Its Past. Chapter 1. The Sign on Main Street. It had stood there for longer than most people in town could remember. A faded wooden board, nailed just above the entrance of the old train depot. The paint was chipped, the letters weathered, but still legible. Whites only. For decades, it had become a fixture of Harper's Hollow, as familiar as the post office bell or the Sunday farmer's market. And yet, it was the one thing no one talked about. Tourists who passed through often snapped photos, puzzled or appalled. College students doing history projects asked questions the townspeople dodged. The mayor called it a relic, while the Historical Society insisted it was an artifact of the past. But for the black residents of Harper's Hollow, what few remained, it was something else entirely. It was a wound that had never closed. 75-year-old Thomas Reed passed by it every morning on his walk to the diner. He remembered the first time he saw it as a child, standing beside his mother, who tightened her grip on his hand and told him softly, "Not our entrance." That sign, to him, was not a piece of history, it was a symbol of humiliation. But things were shifting, quietly, slowly. A new family had moved into town. Rachel and Malik Johnson, young and full of questions. They had relocated from Atlanta to escape the noise of the city and raise their daughter in what they hoped would be a peaceful small-town community. On their third day, they saw the sign. Rachel had paused, staring at it for what felt like hours. Malik had taken a photo. That night, the image went viral. Posted to social media with the caption, "This sign is still up in 2023, how?" It was shared, reposted, and commented on by thousands. National journalists called the town hall, local news vans parked outside the diner, and suddenly Harper's Hollow, population 3,146, found itself at the center of a long overdue conversation. Not everyone was ready to talk, but the sign, once silent, had finally spoken. Chapter 2. A Town Frozen in Time. Harper's Hollow didn't change quickly. It was the kind of town where time seemed to move slower, where people kept routines like family heirlooms and passed down traditions as carefully as they did fine china. For some, that was its charm. For others, it was its curse. After the photograph of the sign went viral, the town reacted not with unity, but division. The diner, usually a place of easy laughter and the clinking of coffee cups, became a battleground of murmured opinions and pointed stares. People picked sides, not based on politics, but on memory, on what they believed Harper's Hollow was or should remain. Old-timers like Mr. Grady insisted the sign had never hurt anybody, that it was just part of the town's history. But for younger voices, and especially those who had always lived in the shadows of that history, the sign was a living reminder of exclusion. Malik and Rachel Johnson became reluctant symbols. They didn't ask for attention, but they couldn't walk into the grocery store without being watched, or, more disturbingly, ignored. Their daughter, Ava, started asking questions too. Why did people whisper when her family entered the bakery? Why didn't any of the other kids want to play with her at the park? Thomas Reed, who had kept to himself for years, found his voice again. He gave an interview to a national paper. He told the story of his mother being turned away from the train depot, of the shame he carried in silence. His words struck chords far beyond Harper's Hollow. Some townspeople doubled down, wrapping their silence in nostalgia. Others began to ask hard questions for the first time in generations. Town meetings grew crowded, arguments flared. An old tape from the 1960s resurfaced, showing the sign being rehung after it had been removed during a brief push for integration. The truth wasn't just inconvenient, it was undeniable. Harper's Hollow, frozen for decades, had been shaken. And though the surface remained still, the cracks beneath had begun to spread. Chapter 3: Whispered Histories. Long before the photograph went viral, the stories lived on, passed in hushed voices over backyard fences, whispered between generations, or muttered after too many sips of coffee at the diner. Harper's Hollow had always maintained two histories, the one in textbooks, neatly typed and celebrated with plaques, and the other, heavy and unspoken, passed from those who had lived it to those willing to listen. Thomas Reed remembered the whispers well. His mother would hush whenever someone asked about the depot. His father would change the subject if the past crept too close to the dinner table. But late at night, when the cicadas sang and the porch light flickered, he'd sometimes speak of the days when black families were told where to stand, where to sit, and when to leave. "You remember that, and you remember it well," he had said once, voice low, "'cause the town won't write it down for you." As the controversy around the sign reignited public interest, younger residents, especially students, began asking more questions. A local high schooler, Maya Benton, took it upon herself to interview older black residents for a class project. She knocked on doors, sat on porches, and listened with a notebook in her lap. She heard about the segregated movie theater where black families had to sit in the balcony even after desegregation was law, about the pool that mysteriously closed the summer the first black child showed up, about the teacher who was quietly fired for suggesting the town's textbooks were missing key chapters. The stories didn't match the tourist brochures or the town museum's displays, but they matched each other, tightly woven with truth, pain, and quiet defiance. The deeper Maya dug, the more she realized how much had been erased, not just facts, but people, lives lived in the margins, voices deliberately muted. She started recording the interviews, posting them online under the title Harper's Hollow: What We Weren't Taught. The videos spread, students shared them, teachers watched in silence. The town's untold history was no longer whispered. It was finally being heard. Chapter 4: The Photograph That Sparked It All. The photograph was supposed to be nothing more than a snapshot, Malik's casual reaction to something that shocked him. But in a town where denial had become a tradition, that one image became a mirror. Taken on a quiet Tuesday morning, the picture captured the sun-washed facade of the old train depot, the crumbling red bricks, and that sign, "Whites Only," dangling like a noose over the front door. Malik had posted it without much thought, anger pulsing through his fingertips. The caption was simple, raw, and honest. Still up, still hurting. Within hours, the post had exploded. Major accounts reposted it. Comment sections flooded with outrage and disbelief. News outlets contacted Malik and Rachel, asking for interviews, statements, opinions. They declined at first, overwhelmed by the sudden attention, but the momentum kept growing. Celebrities weighed in, activists demanded action, some even called for boycotts of local businesses until the sign was removed. In Harper's Hollow, the reaction was mixed. Part disbelief, part embarrassment, part fury. Town meetings turned hostile. Some blamed Malik for bringing bad attention. Others defended the photo as a necessary wake-up call. But what was undeniable was the image's impact. Teachers used it in class discussions. Churches brought it up in sermons. Children started asking questions their parents didn't want to answer. And in that way, the photograph forced a town to look not just at a sign, but at what it had stood for and why it had stood for so long. Even those who had walked past it for decades without blinking suddenly felt its weight. Thomas Reed kept a printed copy of the photo on his kitchen table. He stared at it every morning before his walk to the diner. He didn't need a caption to know what it meant. He had lived the meaning all his life. Chapter 5. Echoes in the Courthouse Walls. The Harper's Hollow Courthouse sat at the center of town like a monument to pride and justice. But for many residents, especially the older black families, it was a building that whispered of silence more than fairness. Built in 1911, its columns and clock tower had seen generations pass, but the stories trapped inside its walls remained largely unheard. In the weeks following the viral photo, the courthouse became an unlikely destination. Reporters, historians, and residents began digging into the archives, requesting access to records long buried in basement cabinets and filing rooms filled with dust. It was Maya Benton who first found the court logs from the 1,950 S and 60 S cases involving land seizures, eviction notices, and business closures that disproportionately affected black families. Some of the pages were water-stained, others incomplete, names were missing, outcomes unclear. But a pattern emerged, a legal system once used to quietly displace and erase. Thomas Reed returned to the courthouse for the first time in decades, walking the halls like a man returning to a battlefield. He pointed to courtroom benches where his father once sat, waiting for a judge who would never say his name. He touched the wood-paneled walls where he remembered standing during jury selection, only to be dismissed before being seated. "It's all here," he said quietly to Maya, who had come to record his testimony. Not in what they said, but in what they didn't. Public hearings began as pressure mounted. The mayor and council members fielded questions about the town's history, but it was the testimonies from people like Thomas and the evidence from those old files that began to crack the town's carefully curated facade. One judge, now retired, wrote an op-ed. "We knew, we saw, and we said nothing." The article was printed in the local paper. For the first time, the courthouse didn't echo with the hollow sound of routine. It echoed with reckoning. Chapter 6. The Teacher Who Spoke Up. Before the town's history made headlines, before the courthouse echoed with buried stories, one voice had tried to crack the silence. A high school history teacher named Claire Matthews. She had arrived in Harper's Hollow 7 years earlier, fresh out of graduate school, with lesson plans full of hope and a bookshelf full of banned books. Claire quickly learned the difference between the curriculum and the truth. Local history classes skipped over segregation, omitted civil rights protests, and celebrated Harper's Hollow as a town untouched by unrest. In her first year, Claire taught a lesson about the Freedom Riders. She included a photo of a burned-out bus and asked her students to consider what silence looked like. That same week, she was called into the principal's office. Stick to the state standards, she was told. She adjusted, softened the language, added nuance, but the questions didn't stop. Some students wanted to know why their grandparents never talked about the marches. Others asked why only certain photos hung in the hallway. And year after year, Claire watched as curiosity turned into discomfort, and discomfort turned into withdrawal. Then came the viral photo, the whites only sign. Claire saw it on her phone during lunch. She printed the image, laminated it, and pinned it to her classroom bulletin board with the title, "Primary Source, Discuss." The next day her classroom was packed. Not just students, parents too. Some applauded her, others shouted. One demanded she be fired. The school board held a meeting. Claire defended her lesson, holding up her state history textbook. "This book ends in 1970, she said. But the sign went up again in 1972. She wasn't fired, but she wasn't welcomed either. Some teachers distanced themselves. Some students dropped her class. But others, many others, began asking more. Claire stayed, not because it was easy, but because truth doesn't retire quietly. Chapter 7. Letters Never Answered. In a box tucked away in the back of the local church, behind a cabinet of outdated hymnals and unused donation envelopes, lay a stack of letters no one had ever answered. Yellowed with age, their corners curling, they told the story of a generation pleading to be seen. The letters were written between 1948 and 1983, mostly from black residents of Harper's Hollow. Some were addressed to the mayor's office, others to the school board, a few to state legislators. They requested everything from equal access to school funding, to street repairs in the black neighborhoods, to an explanation as to why the segregated pool remained closed for maintenance year after year. None of them had replies. The letters were found by accident. Maya Benton, still collecting oral histories for her project, had asked the church's caretaker if any old church records existed. What she got was a cardboard box with "miscellaneous" scrawled across the top. Inside, history lay in silence until she opened it. One letter, dated June 17, 1961, read, "We've swept your streets, cleaned your houses, taught your children. All we ask is to sit at the same counter, to drink from the same glass." Maya read the letters aloud at a town meeting, her voice firm. The silence in the room was heavy. No one moved. No one blinked. After the meeting, people came forward, some with guilt, some with tears. A woman in her 80s said she remembered her father typing one of the letters. A man admitted he found one pinned to his father's wall when he was a child and never asked why. The town had always claimed no one asked for change. But the truth was there. They just never listened. Chapter 8. Digging Beneath the Park. For most of Harper's Hollow, Memorial Park was a quiet, beautiful place. Green grass, tall trees, a playground where children laughed, and an old stone fountain that had long since stopped working. But for some, it was a space built on silence. There had always been rumors that the land once held something else, something never marked with a plaque. Maya Benton heard the stories while interviewing elders for her project. One woman, Miss Georgia, who had lived on the east side of town her entire life, mentioned it casually, like a secret everyone once knew but had chosen to forget. "They built that park on top of something," she said, stirring tea with hands that trembled from age. "We used to call it the Hollow Field. There were graves there before the city moved them, but they didn't move everyone." Maya began to investigate. She looked at maps from the early 1900s, surveyed property records, read through town council minutes. What she found chilled her. In 1923, a section of land had been used as a segregated burial ground for black residents. There were no records of exhumation, no evidence of relocation, and yet the land was now called Memorial Park. She brought her findings to the town historian, who shrugged. Probably just folklore. But Maya didn't stop. With the help of volunteers, she used ground-penetrating radar equipment borrowed from a nearby university. One weekend, quietly and without fanfare, they scanned beneath the playground, beneath the benches, beneath the forgotten corners of the park. The images told the truth the town wouldn't. Burials. Dozens. Some unmarked, some shallow. When she presented the findings at the next town meeting, the silence was suffocating. No one looked at her. The mayor said he'd review it with the proper departments. The next morning, the fountain at Memorial Park had a new sign beside it. It read, "Site under historical review," but Maya already knew. The past wasn't buried. It was waiting. Chapter 9. The Library's Locked Drawer. The Harper's Hollow Public Library stood like a quiet sentinel at the corner of Maple and Church, unassuming, red-bricked, and peaceful. For decades, it had served as a place of stillness, filled with shelves of outdated encyclopedias and town yearbooks. But buried within its hushed halls and faint scent of old paper was a drawer no one had opened in over 50 years. The drawer sat at the bottom of the library's original card catalogue, a relic in the digital age. It had been locked since the 1970s. When asked, the librarians shrugged and said they didn't have the key. Over time, it became part of the library's quiet folklore, the drawer that no one needed and everyone ignored. That changed when Maya Benton began researching the park's burial site. Curious about the library's records, she stumbled across the drawer while combing through old town council notes in the microfilm section. Something about it made her pause. It was dusty, scratched, but intact. A small brass keyhole winked from its center. She asked the head librarian, Mrs. Lindholm, about it. The older woman gave a tight smile. "That drawer hasn't been opened since before I started. Probably nothing inside." But Maya insisted. With permission, she brought in a local locksmith. After a few tense minutes and the twist of an old tool, the lock popped open. Inside was a stack of documents, bundled in twine. Newspaper clippings, old meeting minutes, anonymous letters and photos. Dozens of them, most never published. They told a different story of Harper's Hollow. Protests that were never acknowledged. Families who'd been forced to move. A black-run newspaper shut down after only 6 months of circulation. The most shocking item was a town resolution drafted but never passed, dated 1965, a formal apology for segregation. It had signatures and a bold red stamp across the top, tabled indefinitely. When Maya displayed the contents in a community exhibit, the town responded with a mix of denial, disbelief, and silent recognition. The truth hadn't been lost. It had just been locked away. Chapter 10. The Protest on Willow Lane. It started with a whisper on a community Facebook group. Gathering this Saturday, Willow Lane, 10 a.m. No explanation, no bold calls to action. But the message spread. Flyers quietly appeared at the local barber shop, the farmer's market, the high school bulletin board. By the time Saturday morning came, the quiet street was anything but. Hundreds gathered, not just black residents, but white, Latino, young, old, newcomers, and lifers. Willow Lane, which had once been the center of the town's black business district before it was rezoned and stripped away, had become the heartbeat of Harper's Hollow again. They came carrying signs. Remove the sign. Our history deserves truth. Justice is overdue. Some brought photos of relatives who had lived through segregation. Others brought children on their shoulders. It wasn't loud. There were no chants at first, just the silence of presence, the kind that makes a statement without a sound. Then someone stepped forward. It was Thomas Reed. With his cane in hand and his voice steady, he read aloud a letter, one written by his mother in 1964, asking the mayor to take the sign down. Her words were firm, measured, and heartbreakingly ignored. But now they echoed across Willow Lane. The silence broke. Cheers followed, then chants. "Take it down! Take it down!" The sound grew until it rippled beyond Willow Lane, through town, through online live streams, through the media outlets that had returned to cover the next chapter. The mayor arrived mid-morning, flanked by council members. He tried to speak, but the crowd wasn't there for speeches. They were there for action. At noon, a petition was handed over. 6,432 signatures, more than twice the town's population, signed by people all over the country who now knew Harper's Hollow. The mayor looked at it, nodded solemnly, and walked away. No promises, no applause. But later that night, floodlights lit the train depot, and for the first time in 78 years, a ladder was placed beneath the sign. Chapter 11. Names etched in dust. When the town awoke the morning after the protest, the sign still hung, faded and stubborn. But something else had appeared too. On the sidewalk beneath the train depot, in chalk both bright and smudged, were names. Dozens of them. Names of those who had lived and died in Harper's Hollow. Names of people who had been buried without headstones, forgotten in history books, or pushed out of town without farewell. Names pulled from the letters Maya had found, from church rosters, from old obituaries long ignored. Children knelt beside their parents, helping spell the names. Elders stood quietly, some holding tissues, some holding hands. The chalk lines formed a soft, solemn mosaic, stretching across the street, around the corner, down to Willow Lane. Thomas Reed stood at the center. In his hand was a name written carefully on paper. His sister, Clarissa, who died at 17 after being denied emergency care at the town's whites-only hospital in 1962. He handed the paper to a teenager with a chalk box. The boy nodded and began to write. Some townspeople scoffed. Others watched from their porches. But no one stepped forward to erase the names. By afternoon, news crews returned. They zoomed in on the sidewalk, filmed close-ups of children drawing hearts beside forgotten names, captured voices reciting stories no longer whispered. The sign still cast its shadow over the depot, but beneath it, the town had begun to reclaim something sacred: memory. The names faded with the wind, with footsteps, with the coming rain. But the act of writing them down, of saying them aloud, that couldn't be washed away. Chapter 12. The day they took the sign down. It was a Tuesday morning. The air was still, thick with anticipation. Word had spread through Harper's Hollow that the town council had made a decision, but no one believed it until they saw the ladder. It leaned against the front of the depot like an exhale after generations of holding breath. A maintenance worker, young, white, and silent, climbed the rungs while the town gathered below. No ceremony, no speech, just action. Thomas Reed stood near the front, arms folded, eyes locked on the sign. Beside him were Malik and Rachel Johnson, Maya Benton with her camera, Claire Matthews clutching a notebook, and dozens of others, students, elders, children, all joined by the shared weight of watching history shift in real time. The worker reached the top. He placed both hands on the edges of the sign and slowly began to remove it. It groaned as it came loose, as if protesting the change. For a moment, the town held its breath. Then, finally, it was down. The sign was placed carefully in a cardboard box, which was then handed to a councilwoman who had once called it a piece of heritage. She didn't say a word. Someone clapped. Then another, and another. The sound grew until it became a wave, joyous for some, bittersweet for others. For Thomas, it was a moment of grief and relief intertwined. "It should have come down 60 years ago," he whispered. But it came down now. Later that day, the depot was quiet. The holes where the sign had been still marred the brick, but even they looked different. Not like scars, but like space. Space to remember, to rebuild. The town didn't suddenly transform. There were still arguments, still those who whispered about outsiders and troublemakers. But on that Tuesday morning, the sign came down. And with it, a silence generations old finally broke. Chapter 13. Reparations and Resistance. With the sign removed and the town's attention drawn to its long-neglected truths, a deeper question emerged. What comes next? For some, the answer was healing. For others, it was accountability. And for a growing group within Harper's Hollow, the answer was reparations. The idea wasn't new. Elders like Thomas Reed had spoken of it in quiet gatherings for years, but now younger voices were joining. Maya Benton, her classmates, even Rachel and Malik Johnson, who had initially moved to the town to escape chaos, not stir it. They organized forums in the community center. Not to shout or blame, but to share. People came forward with their stories. Businesses once seized, homes lost to rezoning, generations held back by policies buried in bureaucratic language. An accountant named Desmond Taylor mapped out how lost generational wealth had stunted the black families of Harper's Hollow. The numbers were staggering. In response, the town council proposed a symbolic gesture, a scholarship fund for minority students. Some applauded it. Others saw it as a bandage over a deep wound. Then came the resistance. A local business owner wrote an editorial titled, "We Owe No One Anything." Signs appeared in yards, "Preserve our town's legacy." A counter-petition circulated, accusing activists of shaming good people. Claire Matthews faced pressure at school. Students whispered behind her back. Parents pulled their children from her class. But the voices pushing for repair did not waver. Instead, they grew clearer. They published newsletters, hosted teach-ins, and showed up again and again at council meetings with data, with documents, with dignity. Reparations were no longer a radical idea. They were a reckoning. One night, after a particularly tense public hearing, Thomas Reed stood before the microphone. "My father helped build this town. My mother cleaned its homes. We gave our lives to a place that tried to forget us. But we're still here. And if Harper's Hollow wants to move forward, it's time to pay what's due, not in guilt, but in truth." The room was silent, but the resistance was no longer louder than the call for justice. Chapter 14. A New Generation's Question. Eva Johnson was only 8 years old when the sign came down, too young to understand its full weight, but old enough to feel its shadow. She had watched her parents cry softly that morning, had seen the chalk names beneath the depot, and had heard whispered arguments at school pickup. Weeks after the removal, she sat on her porch with Maya, legs swinging, her small voice cutting through the quiet. Will they ever like us now? Maya, startled, paused. Who, honey? The town, Eva said. Will they ever like us now that the sign's gone? It wasn't bitterness. It was curiosity. The kind only a child could voice without flinching. Maya didn't answer right away, because the truth was complex. Some had welcomed the change, embraced the reckoning. Others had closed tighter, quietly resenting the push to confront their past. Harper's Hollow was no utopian now, but it was no longer sleeping either. In classrooms, students debated reparations and redlining. In barber shops and backyards, neighbors shared stories once locked behind pride. At dinner tables, silence was replaced with uncertainty, and sometimes progress. Eva drew a picture that week. It showed the depot, the ladder, the crowd. At the bottom, in uneven handwriting, she wrote, "We asked, and the sign came down." She presented it during school show and tell. Her teacher framed it and hung it in the hallway. The photo of the sign had sparked a fire, but Ava's drawing planted a seed. It wasn't just about remembering. It was about imagining what came next. Chapter 15. Truth hanging on the wall. Months passed. The ladder was long gone. The depot stood quietly, its bricks worn but free of the sign that had loomed for generations. In its place, above the entrance, was something new. A plaque made of bronze, modest in size but heavy with meaning. It read, "Here once hung a sign that divided a town. It stayed up too long. It came down because people chose to speak." Let this space remind us that silence is never neutral. Thomas Reed was there the day they unveiled it. So was Maya Benton, camera around her neck, notebook in hand. Claire Matthews stood with her students. The Johnsons held Ava close as she gazed up at the plaque, her eyes wide with wonder. No ceremony was planned, but the people came anyway. Some laid flowers, others stood quietly, a few held hands. There were no speeches, only a long, shared silence that felt different now, not like denial, like acknowledgement. Inside the town museum, a new exhibit had opened. What was hidden? It displayed the photograph that started it all. The chalk names now preserved in a digital archive, copies of the letters once unanswered, and the sign itself, framed behind glass, its letters faded but no longer in power. Claire guided her class through the room. Ava's drawing hung at the exit. It was the final piece visitors saw before leaving. "What does truth look like?" one student asked. Claire pointed to the wall. "Sometimes it looks like this. Not neat, not easy, but standing." Harper's Hollow hadn't rewritten its past, but it had finally read it aloud, and in doing so, began writing something new.